Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting slowly down out of an icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening, they lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was! Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and every time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and into the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. No one in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich, steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious, warming dishes. And because we all are a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on and on, he became ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of chocolate, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was the toothpaste factory. The place where Charlie Bucket worked suddenly went bust, and he had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everyone in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory. And every day, as he came near to it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionlessly outside the gate for several minutes on the end, taking deep, swallowing breaths as though he was trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket one icy morning, "that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." But what can one do?" murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I heard his mother try to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, but he won't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. His skin was drawn so tightly under the cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with a curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, also to save his strength. In the mornings, he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during breaks, resting himself, while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face and instantly feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by something silvery lying in the gutter, in the snow. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried in the snow, but he saw at once what it was. It was a 50-pence piece. Quickly, he looked around him. Had someone just dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way part of it was buried. Several people were hurrying past him on the pavement, their chins sunk deep in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the little boy crouching in the gutter. Then was it his, this 50-pence? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole 50-pence! He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment, only one thing. It meant food! Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery shop, the kind that sells almost everything, including sweets and cigars. And what he would do, he whispered quickly to himself, he would buy one luxurious bar of chocolate and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there. And the rest of the money he would take straight back home and give it to his mother. Chapter 11. The Miracle. Charlie entered the shop and laid the damp 50-pence on the counter. "One Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Melt Delight," he said, remembering how much he had loved the one he had on his birthday. The man behind the counter looked fat and well-fed. He had big lips and fat cheeks and a very fat leg. The fat around his neck burst out all around the top of his collar like a rubber ring. He turned and reached behind him for the chocolate bar. Then he turned back again and handed it to Charlie. Charlie grabbed it and quickly tore off the wrapper and took an enormous bite. Then he took another and another, and oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. The sheer blissful joy of being able to fill one's mouth with rich, solid food. "You look like you wanted that one, Sonny," the shopkeeper said pleasantly. Charlie nodded, his mouth burbling with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. "Take it easy," he said. "It'll give you a tummy ache if you swallow it like that without chewing." Charlie went on wolfing the chocolate. He couldn't stop, and in less than half a minute, the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvelously, extraordinarily happy. He reached out a hand to take the change. Then he paused. His eyes were just above the level of the counter. They were staring at the silver coins lying there. The coins were all 5-penny pieces. There were 9 of them altogether. Surely it won't matter if he spent just one more. "I think," he said quietly, "I think I'll just have another one of those chocolate bars. The same kind as before, please." "Why not?" the fat shopkeeper said, reaching behind him again and taking another Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Melt Delight from the shelf. He lay down on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. "It's a golden ticket!" screamed the shopkeeper, leaping about a foot in the air. "You've got a golden ticket! You found the last golden ticket! Hey, would you believe it? Come and look at this, everybody! The kids found Wonka's last golden ticket. There it is! It's right there in his hands!" It seemed as though the shopkeeper was going to have a fit. "In my shop too!" he yelled. "They found it right here in my own little shop. Somebody call the newspapers quick and let them know. Watch out now, Sonny. Don't tear it as you unwrap it. That thing's precious." In a few seconds, everyone was clustering around Charlie, and many more was pushing their way in from the street. Everyone wanted to get a look at the golden ticket and the lucky finder. "Where is it?" somebody shouted. "Hold it up so all of us can see it." "There it is! There!" someone else shouted. "He's holding it up in his hands. See the gold shining!" "But how did he manage to find it, I'd like to know?" a large voice shouted angrily. 20 bars a day I've been fined for weeks and weeks." "Think of all the free stuff you'll be getting too," another voice said enviously. "A lifetime supply." "He'll need it, the skinny little shrimp," a girl said, laughing. Charlie hadn't moved. He hadn't even unwrapped the golden ticket from around his chocolate. He was standing very still, holding it tightly with both hands while the crowd pushed and shouted all around him. He felt quite dizzy. There was a peculiar floating sensation coming over him, as though he was floating up in the air like a balloon. His feet didn't even seem to be touching the ground at all. He could hear his heart thumping away loudly somewhere in his throat. At that point, he became aware of a hand resting slightly on his shoulder, and when he looked up, he saw a tall man standing over him. "Listen," the man whispered, "I'll buy it from you. I'll give you 50 pounds. How about it, eh? I'll give you a new bicycle as well. Okay?" "Are you crazy?" shouted a woman who was standing equally close. "Why, I gave him 200 pounds for that ticket. You want to sell that ticket for 200 pounds, young man?" "That's quite enough of that," the fat shopkeeper shouted, pushing his way through the crowd and taking Charlie firmly by the arm. "Leave the kid alone, will you? Make way there. Let him out." And to Charlie, as he led him to the door, he whispered, "Don't let anybody have it. Take it straight home, quickly, before you lose it. Run all the way home and don't stop till you get there. You understand?" Charlie nodded. "You know something?" the fat shopkeeper said, pausing a moment and smiling at Charlie. "I have a feeling you need to take a break like this. I'm awfully glad you got it. Good luck to you, Sonny." "Thank you," Charlie said, and off he went, running through the snow as fast as his legs would go. As he flew past Mr. Willy Wonka's factory, he turned and waved at it and sang out, "I'll be seeing you. I'll be seeing you soon." And 5 minutes later, he arrived in his own home. And now, Chapter 12, what it said on the golden ticket. Charlie burst through the front door, shouting, "Mother! Mother! Mother!" Mrs. Bucket was in the old grandparents' room, serving them their evening soup. "Mother!" yelled Charlie, rushing in on them like a hurricane. "Look, I've got it! Look, Mother, look! The last golden ticket! It's mine! I found some money in the street, and I bought 2 bars of chocolate, and the second one had the golden ticket, and there were crowds of people around me wanting to see it, and the shopkeeper rescued me, and I ran all the way home, and here I am. It's the 5th golden ticket, Mother, and I found it." Mrs. Bucket simply stood and stared, while the 4 old grandparents, who were sitting up in the bed, bouncing bowls of soup on their laps, all dropped their spoons with a clatter and froze against their pillows. For about 10 seconds, there was absolute silence in the room. Nobody dared to speak or move. It was a magic moment. Then, very softly, Grandpa Joe said, "You're pulling our legs, Charlie, aren't you? We're having a little joke?" "I am not," cried Charlie, rushing up to the bed and holding up the large and beautiful golden ticket for him to see. Grandpa Joe leaned forward and took a close look, his nose almost touching the ticket. The others watched him, waiting for the verdict. Then very slowly, with a slow and marvelous grin spreading all over his face, Grandpa Joe lifted his head and looked straight at Charlie. The color was rushing to his cheeks, and his eyes were wide open, shining with joy. And in the center of each eye, right in the very center, in the black pupil, a little spark of wild excitement was slowly dancing. And the old man took a deep breath, and suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, an explosion seemed to take place inside him. He threw up his arms and yelled, "Yippee!" And at the same time, his long bony body rose out of the bed, and his bowl of soup went flying into the face of Grandma Josephine. In one fantastic leap, this old fellow of 96 and a half, who hadn't been out of bed these last 20 years, jumped onto the floor and started doing a victory dance in his pajamas. "Yippee!" he shouted. "3 cheers for Charlie! Hip, hip, hooray!" At this point, the door opened and Mr. Bucket walked into the room. He was cold, tired, and he looked it. All day long, he had been shoveling snow in the streets. "Graves!" he cried. "What's going on in here?" It didn't take very long to tell him what had happened. "I don't believe it," he said. "It's not possible." "Show him the ticket, Charlie!" shouted Grandpa Joe, who was still dancing around the floor like a dervish in his striped pajamas. "Show your father the 5th and last golden ticket in the world." "Let me see it, Charlie," Mr. Bucket said, collapsing into a chair and holding out his hand. Charlie came forward with the precious document. It was a very beautiful thing, this golden ticket, having been made, so it seemed, from a sheet of pure gold hammered out almost to the thickness of paper. On one side of it, printed by some clever method in jet black letters, was the invitation itself from Mr. Wonka. "Read it out loud," said Grandpa Joe, climbing back into the bed again at last. "Let's all hear exactly what it says." Mr. Bucket held the lovely golden ticket up and close to his eyes. His hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed to be overcome by the whole business. He took several deep breaths. Then he cleared his throat and said, "All right, I'll read it. Here we go. Greetings to you, the lucky finder of this golden ticket, from Mr. Willy Wonka. I shake you warmly by the hand. Tremendous things are in store for you. Many wonderful surprises await you. For now, I do invite you to come to my factory and be my guest for 1 whole day. You and all others who are lucky enough to find my golden tickets. I, Willy Wonka, will conduct you around the factory myself, showing you everything that there is to see, and afterwards, when it is time to leave, you will be escorted home by a procession of large trucks. These trucks, I can promise you, will be loaded with enough delicious eatables to last you and your entire household for many years. If, at any time thereafter, should you run out of supplies, you have only to come back to the factory and show this golden ticket, and I shall be happy to refill your cupboard with whatever you want. In this way, you will be able to keep yourself supplied with tasty morsels for the rest of your life. But this is by no means the most exciting part that will happen on the day of your visit. I am preparing other fantastic surprises that are even more marvelous and more fantastic for you and for my beloved golden ticket holders. Mystic and marvelous surprises that will entrance, delight, intrigue you, astonish, and perplex you beyond measure. In your wildest dreams, you could not imagine what such things could happen to you. Just wait and see. Now, here are your instructions. The day I have chosen for the visit is the first day in the month of February. On this day, and on no other, you must come to the factory gates at 10 o'clock sharp in the morning. Don't be late, and you are allowed to bring with you either 1 or 2 members of your own family to look after you and ensure that you don't get into mischief. One more thing, Be certain to have this ticket with you, otherwise you will not be admitted. Signed, Willy Wonka. The first day of February, cried Mrs. Bucket. But that's tomorrow. Today is the last day of January. I know it is. Christ, cried Mr. Bucket. I think you're right. You're just in time, shouted Grandpa Joe. There's not a moment to lose. You must start making preparations at once. Wash your face, comb your hair, scrub your hands, brush your teeth, blow your nose, cut your nails, polish your shoes, iron your shirt, and for heaven's sake, get all that mud off your pants. You must get ready, my boy. You must get ready for the biggest day of your life. Now don't overexcite yourself, Grandpa, Mrs. Bucket said, and don't fluster poor Charlie. We must all try to keep very calm. And the first thing to decide is this. Who is to go with Charlie to the factory? I will, shouted Grandpa Joe, leaping out of the bed again. I'll take him. I'll look after him. You leave it to me. Mrs. Bucket smiled at the old man. Then she turned to her husband and said, How about you, dear? Don't you think you ought to go? And this is the picture. Well, Mr. Bucket said, pausing to think about it. No, I'm not so sure I should. But you must. There's no must about it, my dear, Mr. Bucket said gently. Mind you, I'd love to go. It'd be tremendously exciting. But on the other hand, I believe the person who really deserves to go, most of all, is Grandpa Joe himself. He seems to know more about it than we do, provided, of course, that he feels well enough. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe, seizing Charlie by the hands and dancing around the room. Well, he certainly seems well enough, Mrs. Bucket said, laughing. Yes, perhaps you're right after all. Perhaps Grandpa Joe should be the one to go with him. I certainly can't go myself and leave the other three people all alone in bed for a whole day. Hallelujah! Yelled Grandpa Joe. Praise the Lord! At that moment there came a loud knock on the front door. Mr. Bucket went to open it, and the next moment swarms of newspapermen and photographers were pouring into the house. They had tracked down the finder of the 5th golden ticket, and now they all wanted to get the full story for the front pages of the morning papers. For several hours, there was a complete pandemonium in the little house, and it must have taken nearly midnight before Mr. Bucket was able to get rid of them so that Charlie could go to bed. I will leave it off at chapter 12. We'll read chapter 13 next.